well, I think we're officially live. I'm going to give it just a hot second to make sure that Facebook is up and going and has us on screen. So those of you who are just tuning in, it is officially, I'm double checking, 5:01. So welcome to Live at 5 with the Mosby Heritage Area Association. I'm Anne Marie Paquette. I'm the Director of Education. And today we have a very special guest. This is Professor Jonathan Noyalas, and he is the Director of the McCormick Civil War Institute at Shenandoah University. Jonathan, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so today, of course, you've written extensively on a number of topics, especially within the Civil War timeframe, but we thought we'd focus a little bit closer to home and talk more about the Battle of Cool Spring. And as an off note, we finally have some sunshine here in Leesburg today. I'm not sure what you're dealing with in West Virginia, but it's kind of a nice getaway to be thinking about a July encounter, which is, the Battle of Cold Spring that we'll be examining today. And as another side note, I know we'll talk more about this later, but the battlefield is open to the public, even while many things are closed. So it is an opportunity that after Jonathan and I inspire you about the Battle of Cool Spring, you can go and visit yourself. So is there anything else that you would like to say, Jonathan, before we start digging in?
No, just again, thanks for having me. This is sort of the new normal for historians now, to do a lot of these Zoom calls. So we'll see how this one goes.
Yeah. So we encourage you guys to comment. You are welcome to comment with any questions or comments that you have throughout. We especially encourage positive commentary. So official request. All right, so July 18th, 1864, there's obviously a lot going on. Jubal Early has just threatened Fort Stevens outside of Washington, D.C., tried to scare Abe like hell with mixed results potentially. So when we're at Cold Spring, what is actually going on? Walk us through the situation.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so, obviously what sets up Cool Spring is Jubal Early's push to Washington, D.C., getting to the outskirts of Fort Stevens on July the 11th. And, really when I take people out to Cool Spring and tour them around the property, one of the first things that I really like to convey to people is just how much territory and how very little, time Jubal Early's army covered in that first month of the summer. So, you think about Early's movements from Petersburg to Lynchburg, moving north through the Shenandoah Valley into Maryland, fighting at Monocacy, getting to Fort Stevens, and then Early making that decision, probably pretty wise decision because of federal reinforcements, and he's kind of cut off from his line of supply, line of communications, to move back into the valley through Snickers Gap on July 16th. His men cover hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles in a relatively short period of time. And everyone always likes to talk about, Jackson's Valley campaign and how many hundreds of miles his men covered in the spring of 1862. Early's men are covering much more territory in a much more condensed period of time. So Jubal Early, his men are completely and utterly exhausted. They are worn out.
They're wiped. And the other thing that I think is unfair too is Jackson, there's a lot of examination about how far they marched, how difficult it was. And people always rib on Early in his campaign about well, if he'd been a bit faster, maybe things would have been different.
Right. Yeah. And so, his men were just completely and utterly exhausted. And, over the years, I've read a lot of letters and diaries of soldiers in his army. And there's sort of this sigh of relief when they get to Castleman's Ferry, when they cross the Shenandoah River, and they're either, right along the river there at Castleman's Ferry or closer to Berryville, thinking they're going to have an opportunity to relax. And that's not the case at all. Because, you have that Union pursuit force of about 25,000 men commanded by General Horatio Wright, who have been directed by President Lincoln to chase after Jubal Early's command. And, this is also one of the interesting things that kind of sets up the battle. People don't realize sometimes that there was fighting after Fort Stevens going on between President Lincoln and General Grant about what was the best course of action to pursue. I mean, people thought it was would think it's a foregone conclusion that Early has been doing all of this stuff, got to the outskirts of Washington, that you would go and you would pursue him. But General Grant didn't necessarily think that that was the best option. He's really focused and intent on destroying Lee's army in front of Petersburg. But again, Lincoln understands, and Lincoln is, after all, the commander in chief, and says, no, we're going to go after Jubal Early first, because we can't continue to have these threats to the capital.
Exactly, because it's also there's a significant part of it, I would think, that's about the optics. You can't have a Confederate army show up in DC and then just let him, scoot away, back over the line.
Yeah, correct. And anything that happens in 1864 is again occurring against that backdrop of Lincoln's campaign for re-election. And so, not dealing with that army that just got to the outskirts of DC is not really a good.
It's not a good look. It's not a good campaign look.
No, not at all. And by the time Horatio Wright, the van of his force, reaches Snickers Gap on the 17th of July, he thinks by and large that it's going to be a pretty easy task to push aside those elements of John B. Gordon's division that are guarding Castleman's Ferry and cross the Shenandoah River and thrash those Confederates. But all throughout the day on July 17th, Union cavalry from Alfred Dufay's division, launched assault after assault after assault, and every single attempt was futile. Then the following day, all throughout the morning, Federal cavalry again tries to break that stronghold at Castleman's Ferry, and they're unable to do it. And this is that very kind of critical moment that sets up what happens on that afternoon into the night of July 18th, where Horatio Wright and General George Crook come to this realization that maybe the best thing to do is to flank the Confederate position at Castleman's Ferry. And that's where the property that's owned by the Shenandoah University comes into play. So the plan was for Colonel Joseph Thoburn's division to traverse through the pathways in the Blue Ridge Mountains, being led by a local scout, John Kerrigan, who actually served in the Clarke Rifles. He deserted from that company and was guiding Thoburn's command through those paths in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and then down the road right in front of Judge Richard Parker's home, down across the retreat, and then to the banks of the Shenandoah River.
That's actually one of my favorite little nuggets about the Battle of Cool Spring, is Kerrigan's involvement in it. Because I think there are a lot of assumptions, in this area, that if you're in Virginia, you were, for the Confederacy through and through. And it's interesting when you see people deserting one side or the other to fight for the opposite side. And do we know in Kerrigan's case whether he was coerced in a participating, or whether he came to Thoburn?
Yeah, so Kerrigan is an interesting figure. A couple of years ago, there was some school of thought that maybe there was a John Kerrigan that showed up as enlisting in one of the regiments that served in Thoburn's division. I don't think it's the same guy, but I think this, Kerrigan, there's still much to learn about him.
Right.
But I think this is, from a historian standpoint, a really instructive moment where you talk about that's not cut and dry when you look at loyalty. So, Kerrigan, of course, he deserted. So, people work under the assumption that just because you were in the Confederate Army, or the Union Army for that matter, that you were all gung-ho and eager to serve. And that's just simply not the case. Some people are inclined to enlist as a result of various social pressures. Some people are drafted and they don't have a choice. They have to go and serve. There are a number of male Unionist sympathizers throughout the Shenandoah Valley who were subject to conscription once that Confederate conscription law went into effect in the spring of 1862. And they were making a mad dash through the Unionist Underground Railroad to get out of the Shenandoah Valley. So, there are some questions about Kerrigan and what brings him, but obviously if he leaves and comes back to Castleman's Ferry where he worked as a tailor, and he is serving as a scout, there has to be a level of trust when federal officers are asking him to do this, that he's not going to lead them into a trap. So I always tell people when I take them out on tours of Cool Spring, it's kind of fun to speculate about Kerrigan. So maybe this was a guy who was drafted and had more pro-union sympathies. Maybe this was an individual who might have enlisted under his own volition, but was worried about family and friends and loved ones at home, and decided to desert. Maybe this was an individual like some of the Confederacy. They get to the summer of 1864 and really start to wonder, is it worth it? Are we going to win this thing? And so, there's a lot of questions that Kerrigan his story certainly raises.
Yeah.
He does, lead Thoburn's men across Judge Parker's retreat to Island Ford. And the lead regiments, commanded by Colonel George Wells, they really thought that they were going to have a pretty easy time when they got to Island Ford. They were not expecting anyone to be there. And lo and behold, there was a contingent of Confederates commanded by Major Jesse Richardson from the 42nd Virginia that were on that opposite shore. And so there was a little skirmish that broke out right there at Island Ford around 3:30 that afternoon of the 18th. And again, when you take, maybe 60, 70 Confederates up against an entire federal brigade, the advantage goes to that brigade. And so they drive off the Confederates pretty easily. But this is a very critical moment in the Battle of Cool Spring that kind of helps this battle evolve into a way that neither Horatio Wright or George Crook would have ever dreamed of. So Wells's command captured 12 Virginians during that small little fight at Island Ford. And what they learned was that, Robert Rhodes' division, Gabriel Wharton's division, elements of Gordon's division, they're all within that vicinity. And so, once Colonel Thoburn found out about this, he was a little bit alarmed. I mean, he has, around 4,500 to 5,000 men in his command. So if you're totaling this up in your head, you're looking at the possibility of maybe tangoing with a force that's about twice the size of your command. And you have a river separating you. The rest of Horatio Wright's command is in Snickers Gap. So you don't have that immediate level of support. So Thoburn actually begged and pleaded with George Crook that afternoon to pull the division back across to the 195 acres that is now owned by Shenandoah University and basically just sit tight.
Right, wait it out.
Yeah, and kind of wait it out and wait for reinforcements and see how things develop. And George Crook said no. He said, you're going to stay there. Don't turn south. Don't try to flank Castleman's Ferry, but put your men in a good position. So Thoburn did what he was ordered to do, and he arrayed his men in 3 lines on the Westwood Farm and the Cool Spring Plantation. But while all of this was going on, you had 2 divisions, Gabriel Wharton and Robert Rhodes, that were approaching Island Ford. And that afternoon, George Crook is up there in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He's looking out. He can see those Confederate divisions advancing toward Thoburn's position. And he is now beginning to think, maybe I should bring Thoburn back to this side of the river. The problem is that Crook needs permission to do this from Horatio Wright, the commander of that Union pursuit force. And Horatio Wright says, no, leave him there. We're going to send reinforcements in the form of General James Ricketts' division from the 6th Corps. So Thoburn is stuck there on that side of the Shenandoah River. And then, about 5 o'clock.
Correct me if I'm wrong, though. Thoburn is definitely stuck, and he's been told that he's going to be there now for the foreseeable future. Right. But as far as his position is concerned, but there is a stone wall there, so he's not completely defenseless. Right. But he's about as well defended as he can be, being abandoned on the far side of a river.
Right. So
with the division in front of you.
Right. Yeah. When Thoburn established his lines, he basically established three lines. So there was a roadbed that ran right along the western bank of the Shenandoah River, where he put a reserve contingent, and there's a stone wall that lined that road. And then about 75 yards up from the bank of the river, he put his main battle line. And then much closer, right on the crest, closer to where the Cool Spring, mansion sits today, and the Abbey, that's where he had his line of skirmishers deployed. So, yeah, I mean, he used the contours of the landscape. He used the features that were there to give himself the best chance possible. But again, as he's doing that, and as messages are getting relayed, he's thinking, okay, I'm eventually going to get support. And ultimately, as I'll discuss here in a moment, that support doesn't materialize. So battle begins around 5 o'clock when Gabriel Wharton's division attacks the southern end of Colonel Thoburn's line. And as I always like to tell people when they come out to Cool Spring, Gabriel Wharton's attack is not the main attraction, but the main distraction.
Yes.
Because what Wharton is doing is buying time, taking the focus away from, what's happening on the field. Meanwhile, Robert Rhodes' division is positioning itself on the northern end of Thoburn's line in a grove of oak trees. And then, lo and behold, 15, 20 minutes after the battle begins, Rhodes launches this flank attack, which has an immediate and dramatic impact. So, you had mentioned the stone walls, and this is all property that's owned by the Abbey, but there are still remnants of these stone walls that run perpendicular to the Shenandoah, that you had about 1,000 men commanded by Colonel Samuel Young. This was a hodgepodge of dismounted Union cavalry from about 27 different regiments who are out there in that position. And by most accounts, Young's troops really don't perform all that well. They maybe fire a volley to at Rhodes' men, and then they turn tail and they leave, moving back across the Shenandoah River. So, I look at things sometimes, I want to help people focus and understand just how in an instant, how very small Thoburn's command became. So if he goes in with about 5,000 men, he's already lost 20% of his force almost, and not to casualties, but to individuals just deciding to retreat across the Shenandoah River. So, his command is cut down pretty quickly. But what's amazing to me about this is Thoburn's leadership. And, Thoburn, who of course ends up being killed at the Battle of Cedar Creek on October 19th, right there in the streets of Middletown. I don't think he received the credit that he deserved for his ability as a battlefield commander, because he recognized what was going on pretty quickly, and he begins to shuffle troops around. Now, sometimes that shuffling led to confusion. So, for instance, he took Colonel Daniel Frost's brigade,
right,
wheeled them to face to the north to kind of present a front to Robert Rhodes' division. So you still had elements of, George Welles's command. They're dealing with Gabriel Wharton, almost fighting a separate battle. And then, Frost is wheeling to the north, and then Thoburn is also shuffling regiments from the southern part of his line to the northern end of his line. And so as all of this unfolds, particularly with Frost's command, Frost is mortally wounded, shot through the bowels, and he dies. And of course, after he is mortally wounded, his men panic and they flee. So you're basically talking about taking almost another brigade out of the equation. So if you're kind of totaling this up, he's probably lost 35, 40% of his command, within the first half hour, 45 minutes of this battle. But this is a really critical juncture in the Battle of Cool Spring, where Thoburn has to make the decision, as well as the other, brigade and regimental commanders who are there. Do we retreat? Do we follow what Frost's men and Young's men did, or do we sit tight and fight? And they all decide, we're going to sit tight and we're going to fight. We're going to wait until the cover of darkness to withdraw. But again, the whole while they're thinking, well, Ricketts is going to come at any moment. And lo and behold, you get about 6 o'clock that evening, Ricketts' division comes to the banks of the Shenandoah, and Ricketts decides, I'm not going to cross, because he already sees, Frost's men, he sees Young's men, he understands what's going on over there. George Crook rightfully protests all of this to Horatio Wright, but Horatio Wright backs up Ricketts, and he says, there's nothing that can be gained as a result of crossing your men over. Basically it would be a suicide mission. So Thoburn can sit tight. Ricketts is going to stay put. The only support that Thoburn received was from 3 Union artillery batteries, 2 Rhode Island batteries, and a West Virginia battery, who did excellent work. I mean, Confederate soldiers in Robert Rhodes' division, wrote about the deadly accurate fire delivered by Battery C and G of the 1st Rhode Island and Battery E 1st West Virginia artillery. And it's pretty remarkable. You think about the numerical disadvantage that Thoburn confronted. He withheld several, assaults from Rhodes' command, and they held their own until nightfall. And again, this is July 18th. So it takes a long time, as my father used to say when he was alive, to get dark. And, you're talking well after 9:30 that night that federal soldiers are going to be pulling back across the Shenandoah River to Judge Parker's retreat. And, once Thoburn's men get back to the property that's owned by the university, there is a lot of bitterness there among these individuals. It was a very awkward scene because you have troops from Ricketts' command are there, and the rank and file from Thoburn's command are saying, why aren't you, why didn't you come and support us? Why didn't you help us?
Right.
This is where the rumor mill starts to begin. And so there are a lot of individuals in the moment and for decades after the war in Thoburn's command who believe that Horatio Wright did this on purpose, that he did not like George Crook, and that he did this to discredit George Crook. And, again, some people who are watching might be aware of this, but there was a lot of animosity between George Crook and Horatio Wright, and it really kind of erupted, right before the Battle of Fisher's Hill, where George Crook had the plan that was actually enacted out to flank Jubal Early's line there, and Horatio Wright wanted to lead that flank assault. And ultimately, there's a major argument that happened just a few days before the Battle of Fisher's Hill. So there was a lot of animosity there between those two guys. I would like to think on a reasonable level that that doesn't come into play, that you're not going to make a poor decision when people's lives are on the line. But again, that's what the men in Thoburn's command ultimately believed. And they thought that if they received that level of support, that the fortunes at Cool Spring could have been very different. But they didn't receive that support.
Right.
And so it becomes a tactical success for Jubal Early.
Exactly. And so the actual losses on either side are just about dead even, right? It's about 400 on both sides. But you're exactly right that the Federals gained nothing from that. And this is one of the, I guess, one of the fewer times in Jubal Early's 64 campaign when buying time was on his side. As he's able to cash out and keep moving.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I've had people ask me, this before when we've been at Cool Spring, why is this a victory for Early? Because, the casualties are about the same and all this kind of stuff. And, it's really a tactical victory when you hold the ground and your enemy, retreats from the field. You can claim that as a tactical victory. But it is certainly, obviously it's one of the last victories that Confederates are going to enjoy in the Valley. But, from the Confederate perspective, they don't stay there all that long.
No.
Because the day after the battle, Jubal Early learned that another Union force commanded by William Averell that was situated in Martinsburg, where I live, was moving from Martinsburg to Winchester. And, Jubal Early understands if Averell gets to Winchester and Horatio Wright's, right along the banks of the Shenandoah, I'm stuck in the middle and I'm done for. So he made that decision to withdraw to Winchester and then south to Strasburg to get out of that predicament that he was in. So, Confederates, and it's interesting, Cool Spring is always one of these battles I feel that is overlooked. Certainly it's not 3rd Winchester, it's not Cedar Creek, it's not New Market, the battles that get all of the attention. But when you really drill down and look at the accounts on both sides, there are a number of soldiers in Robert Rhodes' division. And you think about what Rhodes' command had done and the battles they had been involved in. And there are some soldiers in Rhodes' division basically are saying that this is the hottest engagement. This is the most fierce, the fiercest, the most contested engagement I've been in throughout the course of the war. And that's kind of, surprising when you think about how Cool Spring isn't really as well known as a lot of other battles fought in the Valley and during the course of the conflict.
I think that's a really good point, because I think that we as people who live, so far removed from the war itself, we tend to think of, well, the hardest action is wherever the most deaths were, and there is a bias to that where the proportion of bodies to carnage is not always, scalable in the idea of how fierce the fighting is. And I think it's also interesting that here we are in the late summer of 64, and Filburn knows what he is doing, and Rhodes knows what he's doing, and they've got a great amount of grit, and I think that's showing up a lot here as we're going into the end of 64, the beginning of 65. People's teeth are set is kind of the impression I get.
Yeah, and that's a great point that you've made about statistically looking at a battle, and again, I've said this throughout my time, doing things at Cool Spring over the years, and people like to overlook it. Oh, you only had 13,000 troops engaged, and you only had almost 1,000 casualties. But again, when you drill down to something, and this is kind of really one of my interpretive goals at Cool Spring, is to look at this battle from as much of the individual perspective as possible. Mm-hmm. And it's the number 1,000, okay, we know that's kind of big, but when you start to look at individual stories and how these families who lost a loved one at Cool Spring were affected, or how someone who was wounded at Cool Spring was affected for the rest of their lives, not only physically but also psychologically. I always say that, and this is something that one of my former colleagues, Dr. Joe Whitehorn, who many people undoubtedly out there in the Facebook world know, if you're shot in a battle, or you had someone you love shot in a battle, that's the most important battle of the war. Yes. Doesn't matter how many troops are engaged. If it's a small little skirmish somewhere, or somebody's out on picket post, that's the most transformative, important moment of any conflict for you.
I agree, and I also think that there's also, I think, a name recognition part of it, and to me that brings in the connection with Shenandoah University too. Is I know when the university, it was 2013, wasn't the university kind of jumped in on the project in presentation and education in that. And I remember reading an article about it, and someone said, it's about time part of the campus actually had the Shenandoah running through it, was kind of the idea. And so there's also this idea of people today, even if they didn't have a relative who was here, or had relatives who fought in the Civil War at all, but the idea that they relate to this spot, to this ground, to a conflict that happened here, regardless of, regardless that Napoleon didn't fight here, right? Regardless that this wasn't Gettysburg.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm scrolling through to check for any questions that we have. We do have a comment complimenting your Bills cup, so that's good. That was Joe Rizzo from the Lawn Museum. We've got a lot of people chiming in. They didn't know this much about the Battle of Cool Spring. I think that it is a bit of a footnote in a lot of a lot of historical renderings, especially when you're talking about the 64 campaign, Jubal Early going up and around. There's much more about Monocacy, I think, and Fort Stevens, and less about when he re-enters the valley. But so this actually obviously has repercussions for the Union command line too, because until this point, wasn't it Hunter who was technically in charge here? He was put in May, burned VMI, made a whole lot of ruckus, and then when Jubal Early actually threatens the valley, he skedaddles up towards Kanawha, which of course he defends vehemently afterwards, but he's only going to stay in command for another couple weeks after Cool Spring.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And, again, you're 100% correct that this has always been treated as a footnote to Early's push to Washington. He got to Washington and all that stuff, scared Abe Lincoln like hell, which interestingly, I think of all the people in Washington, Lincoln was not frightened at all. If you look at his reaction, I mean, there are people in the War Department who are freaking out. And Lincoln is, pretty confident in the defenses of the city and the guns and the reinforcements and all that kind of stuff. But it really is treated as, he got here and then he went back to Virginia and there was a little battle along the Shenandoah River. And then we move on to Second Kernstown, and then Phil Sheridan, comes to command in the first week of August. So, I just want to say a little bit, if I have
absolutely, yes, please.
So, one of the things that we've been trying to do through the McCormick Institute out at Cool Spring is to really educate the public, people who come there or people who want to, learn about it from afar, to give them different tools in order to do this. So, we have, traditional printed battlefield guides. So if you go out to Cool Spring, and I'll just hold it up here, you can get, one of these at the kiosk. It's also available as a downloadable PDF on our website, which is www.su.edu/MCWI. But as you know from some of the discussions we've had previously, we are also trying to dabble a little bit in other interpretive technologies to kind of, again, make the battle a little bit more personal for individuals. So we have taken, accounts from Union and Confederate soldiers. And last spring in May, we filmed over the course of 2 days these little vignettes to create a virtual reality experience. Our plan was, we kind of debuted it last summer at the 155th anniversary. Our plan was to roll it out this coming summer, but plans are kind of a little bit in a state of flux. But you'll eventually get to the point where you can go to Cool Spring and take your, smartphone or iPad and download an app, and it's GPS enabled, and you can walk around on those trails, and you'll get to a certain point, and the app will come on, and it will take you into this particular moment, looking at the battle from, this an individual perspective, Union or Confederate. And we're also developing an audio augmented reality tour that will kind of work in the same way, a little bit more accounts. And then students, and again, a lot of this stuff is student driven. So we use it as a laboratory to help our students understand how to do public history. So I don't know if I have any students in my History 309 Interpreting Civil War Sites class watching or not, but they just finished a semester-long project to develop a script for an orientation film for Cool Spring. And they understand now how difficult it is to write to capture so much history in 7 minutes.
Yes.
And they were able to pull it off. So we'll move into production phase on that. So we're always, using this as an opportunity to give our students real world experience and also educating the public about Cool Spring.
It's so exciting too, just to see, digital media, augmented reality, et cetera, being able to be applied to history, because a lot of what I think the trouble is in getting new or different audiences interested in history is they just don't feel like it's tangible.
Right.
Even if you bring them to the battlefield, even if you show them the entrenchments, all of that, there's whatever can make it more real and obviously correct, researched and documented, I think is a tremendous resource.
Yeah, and I think technology in particular, I mean, we're fortunate at Shenandoah to have a Center for Immersive Learning that does virtual and augmented reality. And, the director of that, JJ Rusella, a great friend, a great guy, a great visionary. Um, Using virtual reality and technology, I think personalizes this in a way that a printed tour cannot.
Yes.
So there are so many people who come out to Cool Spring who might not have an interest in the Civil War. All right. And they might read the different Civil War trail signs that we have out there. They'll pick up that tour brochure and they'll learn a little bit. But man, when you think about, looking at these individual stories and these accounts, very powerful accounts of how the battle impacted an individual, I think that tugs at your heartstrings a little bit, makes it more understandable. And when you're able to connect with people on that personal level, I think that does pique their curiosity and interest, understanding that this is not just something that happened a long time ago, but this is something I can learn from. This is something I can take inspiration from, to deal with, current issues. I mean, I talk to my students all the time about how history teaches us to hope. And, history provides perspective. When the pandemic hit, I did a number of interviews with different educational institutions offering a historian's perspective, and I basically made the point that when bad things happen, I think historians are always the ones who don't freak out because nothing is new.
Right. Whether from nihilism or optimism, there's something to be said about, history. If it doesn't repeat itself, history rhymes, and so the people face the same problems in every generation, in every century, whatever it is.
Yeah, and if you understand how people have coped with that, then I think it helps provide a framework for you to deal with the situation as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's true, but I'm obviously biased. We can handle whatever it is. We did have a question asking what happened to Early and Wright. So we talked a little bit about Early. He comes back into the valley. Wright just goes back to where he came from.
Correct.
He was never intended to stay or take up residence in the valley. He was always supposed to go back up to the capital.
Right. So, the kind of the critical moment here that gets Wright out of the valley is the Battle of Rutherfords Farm on July 20th, 1864. So this was a kind of another smallish engagement with General Averell's command and General Stephen Dodson Ramseur's division just north of Winchester. So, for our viewers out there, if you're familiar with Winchester, Rutherfords Farm basically is exit 317 off of Interstate 81. But, the basic point here is that William Averell was outnumbered by a margin of 2-1 at the Battle of Rutherfords Farm, and he won the battle. So,
no big deal.
Yeah, so Horatio Wright is thinking, okay, if Averell won this battle when he was so severely outnumbered, well, then Jubal Early must be in retreat. He must be, moving across the Blue Ridge back to Petersburg. So I'm not needed here anymore, and that begins that drawdown of troops. Of course, that's not what Jubal Early is doing at all. And Early was a very, stubborn, cantankerous kind of fellow. And he always had ringing in his ears a directive that Robert E. Lee gave to him before he, cuts him loose from Petersburg to go to the valley and do what he does. And again, sometimes people lose sight of this, but Jubal Early's campaign in the valley in the summer of 1864 essentially is supposed to do the very same thing that Jackson's Valley campaign did in 1862. And, Early isn't like Jackson. He is there to create a strategic diversion to draw troops away from Petersburg. And Early does that. But, Early, when he learns about that drawdown of troops after Rutherford's Farm, he hears this directive kind of ringing in his mind from Robert E. Lee. If you can't continue to do what you're supposed to do in the valley, and that is divert attention away from Petersburg, then you need to quit the valley. And Early did not want to do that. And so, this becomes the whole impetus for what happens on July 24th at the Second Battle of Kernstown.
Yeah, yeah. There is so much, that happens between June and December of 64, here in this area, um, between the forces coming in and out. It looks like we do have a student from your class. Nikki is watching, so you can give her extra credit, I guess. I assume that
she has to defend her thesis on Friday next week. So
maybe she should be studying instead of watching Facebook. No, I'm kidding. So it looks like we didn't have too many more questions. A lot of people are continuing to comment that they're chiming in, that they're loving the discussion. Can you talk a little bit more about, so the McCormick Civil War Institute is obviously doing some tremendous things with education in the park, on site, but they are also doing science classes and learning too, are they not?
So, well, the university is.
But the university is, not the institute. But I was just curious about that relationship.
Yeah, so we have environmental studies program at Shenandoah University. Dr. Woody Bousquet had guided that program throughout his great illustrious career at SU. He retired last year, I believe. So it's also used as an environmental laboratory for our students. Again, not Civil War students, but our environmental studies students. And there are so many, different sorts of habitats and plants and those types of things out there that our students can study. And what I think environmental studies and our history students understand is that we are great partners and collaborators at battle sites. We have a mutual interest in preserving these natural landscapes from an environmental studies standpoint and also a historic standpoint. A couple of years ago, 2 years ago, I believe it was, Earth Day, the Civil War Institute, we conducted a special tour out there for Earth Day in conjunction with environmental studies students to talk about, how as historians, we try to work within the natural landscape to not destroy things and to kind of enhance the site. So yeah, it is a great outdoor classroom for our students of various disciplines at the university.
And I think that's tremendous because it's, we have a number of partnerships similar to that, with the Land Trust of Virginia and other organizations to preserve the landscape. And I think it's so, encouraging, inspiring to see, academic relationships that are doing the same thing and demonstrating this idea that you can be excellent in your field and you can be specialized in your field, but also be reaching across those academic aisles, because we all want a lot of the same things in terms of historic resources, in terms of landscapes, in terms of applying technology. It's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Cool. Well, great. I think that is about where we are for today. A final hello from several viewers. Thank you all for tuning in. Jonathan, do you have any last minute takeaways or suggestions for people who want to know more about Cool Spring?
Yeah, I would just say, when the opportunity presents itself to go out and walk the trails, feel free to do so. You can, look at the tour brochure that we have online. Also, we're always doing different things to, again, drill a little bit deeper so we gain a more intimate knowledge of the battle. So every year, the McCormick Civil War Institute publishes a journal, which looks like this. It's Journal of the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War era, retails for $10. All proceeds benefit the Institute. So there's my commercial advertisement. But in volume number 3, which came out at the end of 2019, we finished a multi-year project with our students in Civil War Studies at Shenandoah, where we studied every single Union soldier who was killed or mortally wounded at the battle. And we published the biographies of these guys. We're actually finishing up a project now where we're looking at all the backgrounds of every single Confederate who was killed or mortally wounded at the battle. And we'll publish those in volume 4 of the journal. So, we're always working. I'm never a person who's satisfied, so we do stuff and I'm always thinking about, well, what else can I do?
Sure.
So we're always continuing to evolve and to grow. When this pandemic is over and restrictions are lifted, I welcome people to come out to Cool Spring, to the lodge. We have an exhibition there with a number of artifacts from Clarke County Historical Association on loan and some other things that we've added. So, there's a lot that goes on at Cool Spring throughout the course of the year. We would have more going on, if we weren't in the situation we are. But there are still ways that you can read about this battle, learn about this battle, and come to appreciate its lessons.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Again, this is Jonathan Noyalas, the director of the McCormick Civil War Institute with Shenandoah University. If you're interested in more about Cool Spring, I suggest you go take a visit, check it out online. As well, the Cool Spring Battlefield is part of the Mosby Heritage Area. If you're interested in what we do have a talk coming up this Sunday with author Mark Leipson talking about saving Monticello. And every Thursday, we also have a History on Tap program as well. So keep an eye out for myself, keep an eye out for Jonathan and the folks at SU. And thank you all for joining us today.
Bye-bye.